I heard it before I understood what I was hearing. A faint, rhythmic buzzing coming from somewhere inside the bedroom wall, low and persistent, the kind of sound that doesn't belong anywhere in a house and immediately makes you start cataloging what could possibly be making it. My name is Derek, and I've spent 17 years as an HVAC technician, which means I know the particular language of a house's mechanical sounds better than almost anyone. The click of a thermostat cycling, the hum of a blower motor starting up, the rattle of a loose damper. This wasn't any of those. This was a phone, vibrating against metal, somewhere behind the wall. It was just past midnight on a Tuesday in March. Paige was asleep beside me, her breathing slow and even, and I lay there for a long moment, trying to place the sound, before I got up and followed it to the air vent near the floor on her side of the bed. The same vent I'd serviced myself 18 months earlier when we'd had the whole system inspected, the same vent I could have sworn, with the particular professional certainty of a man who does this for a living, had nothing behind it but ductwork. I knelt down in the dark, pulled the grate off with my fingers, and reached into the duct, and my hand closed around something that should not have been there. A phone, an old one, cheap, the kind of prepaid model you buy at a drugstore, taped to the inside of the metal duct with a strip of black electrical tape, still buzzing faintly with an incoming call that cut off into voicemail right as I pulled it free. I sat on the floor of my own bedroom at 12:15 in the morning, holding a phone I'd never seen before, that had apparently been hidden 2 inches from where my wife slept every single night, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. The particular stillness that comes right before you understand a thing is going to be far worse than your first instinct is telling you. I want to be honest and tell you that my very first thought wasn't betrayal. It was almost administrative, the same way you assess a mechanical failure before you let yourself feel anything about its consequences. Whose phone is this? Why is it taped inside my own ductwork? Why is it still charged enough to receive a call at midnight? Which means somebody's been maintaining it. I turned it over in my hands in the dark hallway, having stepped out of the bedroom so the small glow of the screen wouldn't wake Paige, and pressed the power button, and watched it light up to a lock screen with no name, no photo, nothing, just a default wallpaper and a battery icon at 62%. 62%. Somebody had charged this phone recently. Somebody had been keeping it alive. I stood in that hallway for a long time, the phone warm in my hand, the house otherwise completely silent around me, and I thought about every single thing I thought I knew about my marriage. 12 years, 2 kids, a life I'd genuinely believed, right up until that exact moment, was solid in the unglamorous, dependable way I'd always valued more than excitement. Paige and I had met in our mid-20s, married at 28, built a life in Wichita that revolved around our 2 kids, Tyler, 10, obsessed with building elaborate Lego cities that took over half the basement, and Bree, 7, who still insisted on a specific bedtime routine involving 3 stories and a very particular stuffed rabbit. I worked steady hours fixing other people's heating and cooling systems. Paige worked from home doing customer support for a software company, a job that let her be present for the kids' school schedule in a way mine couldn't always match. I went back into the bedroom and looked at Paige sleeping, her face turned toward the wall, toward the vent, and felt something crack open in my chest that I didn't have words for yet. I didn't wake her. I didn't say anything. I took the phone, turned it off completely, and put it in my truck's glove compartment before I went back to bed, lying awake until the gray light started coming through the blinds, trying to construct some version of an innocent explanation that the facts simply refused to support. I didn't say anything to Paige the next morning or the morning after that, and I want to explain why, because the decision still doesn't feel entirely rational even now, looking back on it. I am, by trade and by temperament, a man who diagnoses problems methodically before fixing them. You don't replace a compressor based on a single symptom, you trace the whole system first, because acting on incomplete information in HVAC work means you've fixed the wrong thing and the real problem just resurfaces somewhere else. Worse. I told myself I was applying the same logic here. I needed to understand the full scope before I said a single word, because once I said something, there would be no controlling what happened next. What I didn't yet understand was how much of the preceding year I'd already lived through without registering what was actually happening underneath it. Paige and I had settled, over the previous couple of years, into a rhythm that I genuinely believed was just the ordinary texture of a long marriage with young kids. Efficient, functional, occasionally affectionate, rarely electric. We split household duties without much friction. We coordinated schedules well. We rarely fought, mostly because we rarely talked about anything beyond logistics. Who was picking up Tyler from practice, whether Bree needed new shoes, what we were doing for the in-laws' anniversary. I told myself, more than once, that this was simply what marriage looked like at year 12, and that the absence of conflict meant the absence of problems. Looking back now, I can identify a shift that started roughly a year before I found that phone, though at the time none of it registered as anything beyond ordinary domestic variation. Paige had started spending more evening time on her laptop after the kids went to bed, which I'd attributed entirely to work. She'd mentioned, around that time, a new project at her company that required more after-hours coordination with a team in a different time zone. I'd never questioned it, because it fit easily into the existing shape of her job. She'd also started using a separate headset for calls, which she explained as a work requirement for confidentiality during customer support sessions, something about company policy around overheard conversations. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was a little excessive for a customer support job, but not enough to actually ask a follow-up question, because nothing about it felt urgent enough to interrupt whatever I happened to be doing. Tyler, oddly, was the one who first said something that I filed away without examining. The way these comments always seem to land with kids before any adult catches the pattern. Mom laughs a lot at her computer at night, he said one evening, not looking up from his Legos. Like a lot. That's good, bud, I said. Glad she's having fun. I didn't think anything else of it. I want you to understand that I'm not telling you this to set up some dramatic reveal where I claim I should have caught it sooner. I genuinely didn't catch it, not because I wasn't paying attention in some broad sense, but because nothing about our marriage had ever given me reason to develop the kind of vigilance that catches small inconsistencies before they become a pattern. We didn't fight. We didn't have dramatic blow-ups. Our marriage, as far as I understood it, simply didn't generate the kind of friction that makes a person suspicious. What I also didn't understand, not yet, was that the absence of friction wasn't necessarily evidence of a healthy marriage. It could just as easily be evidence of two people who'd stopped engaging with each other deeply enough to generate any friction at all, which is its own kind of warning sign I simply lacked the framework to recognize. Paige started taking her laptop into the bathroom some evenings, for better Wi-Fi, a habit I noticed and filed away as a minor, forgettable quirk. She started going for solo walks in the evening more frequently after the kids were in bed, which she framed as needing some quiet time to decompress, something I genuinely encouraged, because I believed, sincerely, that everyone needs space, and I had no reason to think her need for space was about anything other than exactly what she said it was about. By the time I found that phone in the air vent, I'd accumulated, without realizing it, almost a year's worth of small behavioral shifts that, individually, had each seemed completely reasonable, and that, only in retrospect, formed a shape I'd never once stepped back far enough to actually see. The week after finding the phone, I drove to a hardware store an hour outside Wichita, somewhere I'd never normally shop, and bought a cheap phone charger compatible with the model I'd found, then sat in my truck in the parking lot and charged it enough to actually look through it properly, away from the house, away from any chance Paige might notice what I was doing. What I found, once the phone powered back on fully, was a single contact saved simply as C, and a text thread going back, according to the earliest visible messages, nearly a full year, far longer than I'd initially imagined possible. The messages themselves were careful, in a way that struck me immediately as the product of real practice. No names beyond the initial C. No specific identifying details about location or workplace. Just an ongoing, intimate correspondence that read, even stripped of names, with an unmistakable emotional weight. Miss you today. Wish you were actually here instead of just on the other end of this. Tell me about your day, the real version, not the version you give everyone else. I think about what it would be like if things were different more than I probably should. I sat in that parking lot for almost an hour, scrolling backward through months of messages, feeling something in my chest tighten with every screen I read. There was no name attached to C anywhere in the thread, no last name, no photo, no location beyond a single oblique reference to 2 states over. No detail I could use to actually identify who this person was. Whoever C was, They'd been deliberate about staying obscured even within a conversation meant for nobody else's eyes, which told me something unsettling about how careful both of them had been about protecting this from discovery. I found, scrolling further back, the earliest messages, dated almost 14 months earlier, originating from what looked like an online forum for a strategy game. Page had mentioned playing occasionally, something I'd always pictured as a casual hobby, a way to unwind after the kids were in bed. The earliest exchanges were ordinary, forum-adjacent, comments about gameplay, in-jokes about other users, nothing that read as anything beyond casual online acquaintance. Somewhere around month 3 of the thread, the tone shifted gradually, the gameplay references thinning out, replaced by longer, more personal exchanges about each other's days, their frustrations, their loneliness. I drove home that evening in a kind of numb, controlled fury, the phone hidden again, this time in a lockbox in my truck rather than back in the vent, and I spent the following week doing what I now recognize as a methodical surveillance operation on my own household, watching for the specific moments Paige reached for her laptop, noting the timing of her evening walks, the duration of her headset calls, cross-referencing all of it against what I now understood to be an ongoing relationship that had clearly continued well past whatever point I'd happened to find that phone. I noticed, watching with new attention, that Paige's evening walks had started occurring on a specific schedule, every Tuesday and Thursday, almost without exception, lasting just over 40 minutes, always alone, always with her own personal phone left visibly on the kitchen counter while she walked, which I now understood, with fresh and bitter clarity, was likely a deliberate decoy, a way of demonstrating openness with the device she knew I might check while the actual communication happened somewhere else entirely. The strangest, most unsettling discovery came nearly 2 weeks after finding the phone, when I noticed, going back through the message thread on one of my furtive parking lot review sessions, a string of messages referencing an actual in-person meeting. Not online, not hypothetical, but a real visit, 3 months earlier, to a city roughly 4 hours away. During a weekend, Paige had told me she was visiting her college roommate for a girls' weekend. Still can't believe we actually did that. Wasn't sure it would feel the same in person, but it was better, somehow. I sat with that message for a long time, feeling something in my chest collapse entirely, because whatever this had been, it had clearly stopped being purely digital months earlier, and I had driven her to the airport myself for that trip, helped her load her suitcase into the car, kissed her goodbye in the driveway with our kids waving from the porch. By the 3rd week, I'd shifted from passive observation to something more deliberate, because I understood, with growing certainty, that I needed enough concrete information to make sure whatever conversation came next couldn't be talked down into something smaller than what it actually was. I checked our joint credit card statement going back to the period of the supposed girls' weekend, and found a hotel charge in the destination city that didn't match the modest budget motel Paige had described staying at with her roommate, a charge from a considerably nicer hotel downtown, for 2 nights instead of the one she'd mentioned, paid through a separate account I hadn't realized she maintained, something she'd apparently set up specifically to keep certain expenses off our shared statement entirely. I called the roommate directly, a woman named Sarah who I'd known for years, framing the call as innocuous catching up, asking how the girls' weekend had gone. Sarah's response came back with a confused pause that told me everything before she'd even finished the sentence. "Oh, we didn't actually do anything that weekend. Derek." Paige said she was coming through, but then said her flight got rearranged and she ended up just doing her own thing downtown instead. We grabbed coffee for like 20 minutes. "Why, is everything okay?" I told her everything was fine and hung up, sitting with that confirmation for a long time, feeling the particular cold clarity of having an alibi independently and completely collapse. I drove past the hotel in question on a work trip that took me reasonably close to that city anyway, not expecting to find anything new, just needing, the way I had with the air vent itself, to physically stand near the place that had absorbed an entire weekend of my wife's actual life, while I believed she was somewhere else entirely. I didn't go inside. I sat in my truck across the street for 20 minutes and then drove home. I requested, through a contact at the phone carrier I occasionally worked with on commercial HVAC contracts for their office buildings, an informal favor, nothing official, just confirmation of whether the burner phone SIM card had an identifiable carrier account attached to it. What came back gave me a partial billing address, 2 states over, matching exactly the oblique reference C had made in their messages, but no name beyond an account holder listed simply as C. Reyes, which still left me without a full picture of who exactly my wife had been building a 14-month relationship with. I sat with the partial name, C. Reyes, for several days, debating whether to dig further to find out exactly who this man was, where he lived, what he looked like. In the end, I decided against it, not out of any particular restraint, but because I understood, somewhere in the exhausted clarity of that third week, that the specific identity of the other man mattered less to me than the 14 months Paige had spent building an entire parallel emotional life while sleeping beside me every single night. I found, finally, going back through the burner phone's message history one last time before deciding I had enough, a message from just 4 days earlier. After I'd already found the phone, already removed it from the vent, already known everything, a message Paige had apparently sent from her own personal phone, having clearly noticed the burner missing from its hiding place. I think he might have found it. I don't know what to do. I'm scared. And a response from C. Don't panic yet. Wait and see if he says anything. Maybe it's nothing. I sat with that exchange for a long time, understanding, with a fresh and bitter clarity, that Paige had known, for nearly 2 weeks, that something had likely gone wrong, and had chosen to wait silently, watching me, gauging whether I'd noticed, rather than saying a single word. I decided, that same night, that I was done waiting for her to bring it up first. I confronted her on a Friday evening, after the kids had gone to bed, the burner phone sitting on the kitchen table between us, fully charged, screen lit to the message thread I'd spent 3 weeks reading. I know, I said, before she'd even fully sat down. I found this in the air vent 3 weeks ago. I know about Cole, or whoever the hell he actually is. I know about the hotel in Topeka that wasn't your girl's weekend. I called Sarah. I know you've known I might have found it for 2 weeks, and said nothing. Paige's face went through several things in rapid succession. Shock first, fast and total, then something that hardened almost immediately into a kind of defensive fury that I hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for. You've been going through my things for 3 weeks and didn't say anything, she said, her voice already rising. You've been spying on me? Don't, I said, my own voice rising to match hers immediately, faster than I expected, the careful control I'd maintained for 3 weeks evaporating the instant she tried to flip this into something about my behavior instead of hers. Don't you dare make this about how I found out. You hid a phone in our bedroom wall, Paige, 2 inches from where you sleep every night. Because I knew exactly what would happen if you found it, which is apparently exactly what's happening right now. Her voice cracked into something louder, sharper. You don't even want to understand anything. You just want to stand there with your evidence like you're diagnosing a goddamn furnace. Don't turn this into me being the problem. You spent 14 months building an entire secret relationship with someone I don't even have a real name for. Maybe I needed someone who actually talked to me. Derek. She was standing now, her voice loud enough that I instinctively glanced toward the stairs, worried about waking the kids, an awareness she seemed to have lost entirely. Do you know what it's like living with someone who only talks about furnace parts and pickup schedules? 12 years. And you asked me how my day was the way you'd ask a coworker, completely on autopilot, never actually waiting for the real answer. That's not fair, I said, my own voice cracking now too, loud, raw, years of unexamined resentment apparently surfacing in both of us at once. I work a physical job all day. I come home tired. And somehow that's an excuse for you to go find some stranger online too. He's not a stranger, she snapped, cutting me off. He's the only person in 14 months who's actually asked me a real question and waited to hear the real answer. Then why didn't you ask me for that instead of hiding a phone in the wall like a criminal? Because I knew exactly how you'd react. And look, here we are. You're standing there screaming at me instead of asking one single question about why I needed it in the first place. We were both standing now, both shouting, old grievances surfacing that had nothing directly to do with the phone. A fight about money from years earlier, a resentment about how often I'd canceled plans for work calls, a complaint she'd apparently been sitting on for years about feeling like a roommate instead of a wife. All of it flooding into the room at once, overlapping, neither of us actually listening to the other, both of us simply needing somewhere to put years of accumulated pressure. that had nothing left holding it back. "You made me feel invisible for years," she shouted. "And the second I found someone who actually saw me, you want to act like I'm the only one who broke something here. I never cheated on you, Paige." My voice had gone hoarse, raw. "Whatever you think I did wrong, I never once." "Maybe that's not the only way to break a marriage," she shouted back and grabbed a coffee mug off the counter and threw it. Not at me, just down, hard, onto the kitchen tile, where it shattered into a dozen pieces, the sound of it sharp and sudden enough that we both, for one frozen second, went completely silent. And in that silence, from the top of the stairs, a small voice. "Mom? Dad?" Bree, 7 years old, standing in her pajamas at the top of the staircase, woken by the noise, her face confused and frightened in a way that neither of us had any way to undo in that moment. The fight stopped instantly, both of us turning toward the stairs, both of us suddenly aware, with a cold, sobering clarity, of exactly what our daughter had just heard. Paige went up first, her voice shifting immediately into something soft and reassuring, telling Bree it was nothing, just a broken mug. "Go back to bed, sweetheart." And I stood in the kitchen amid the shattered pieces, my hands shaking, the burner phone still lit on the table, feeling the entire force of the previous 20 minutes drain out of me all at once, replaced by something heavier and far more exhausted. Neither of us spoke for the rest of that night. Paige slept in the guest room. I stayed in the kitchen for almost an hour, cleaning up the broken mug, sweeping every piece carefully off the tile, needing something physical to do with my hands. The next morning, after the kids left for school, we sat at the same kitchen table, both of us exhausted, the adrenaline from the previous night fully drained, replaced by something quieter and more honest than the shouting had allowed for. "I need you to actually tell me everything," I said. "Not shout it at me. Just tell me." Paige was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the previous night's fury left in it, just a tired, raw honesty that felt, somehow, harder to hear than the screaming had been. "It started 14 months ago, in that gaming forum, completely by accident," she said. "Cole, that's actually his name, by the way, not some code. I just never told you because some part of me knew the moment I said his real name out loud it would become undeniably real, instead of something I could keep telling myself was harmless." We started talking about the game, and then about everything else, slowly, over weeks. I want to be honest that I didn't go looking for this, Derek. I was just lonely in a way I didn't fully understand yet, and he asked me real questions, and kept asking them, every single day, in a way that felt like water after years of feeling thirsty without realizing it. The first time it became something more than talking was around month 5, when he sent a voice message instead of texting, just to hear how I'd respond, and I sat in the bathroom listening to it on repeat, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, and I told myself, that night, that it was harmless, that two people talking honestly wasn't the same as betrayal. I believed that for a long time, Derek. I genuinely did. I built an entire justification around the idea that emotional honesty with someone else didn't actually threaten our marriage as long as nothing physical ever happened. And then the trip happened 3 months ago, and I told myself, even driving to the airport with you helping load my suitcase, that I still wasn't sure I'd actually go through with anything, that maybe seeing him in person would break whatever spell I'd built around this entire thing in my head. It didn't break it. It made it worse, in the sense that it became real in a way it hadn't been before, and I came home and felt sicker about it than I'd ever felt about anything in my life, and I still didn't stop. I hid that phone in the vent because some part of me had already decided I wasn't ready to lose either thing. Not you, not the kids, not this house, and not him either, and I think, looking back, that decision to hide rather than choose was its own kind of cowardice that I'm only now starting to actually see clearly. The 2 weeks before you confronted me, after I noticed it was missing, I was terrified, every single day, waiting for you to say something, rehearsing what I'd say, and the not knowing ate at me worse than almost anything in the entire 14 months combined. I think some part of me, last night, screaming at you, was as much about that 2 weeks of terror finally breaking as it was about anything else. I sat with all of that for a long time, the kitchen quiet around us, both kids' school bags still sitting by the door from that morning's rush. "I don't think I can do this anymore," I finally said. Not because of the screaming last night, though that scared me too, watching us turn into people I didn't recognize in front of our own daughter. Because of the 14 months. Because you built an entire other relationship and let me believe everything was just quietly, unremarkably fine. I know, she said quietly. I'm not going to pretend that's not exactly what I did. I need you to move out, I said. I'll figure out what to tell Tyler and Bree, something that doesn't involve either of us screaming again in front of them. But I can't keep living in a house where I'm checking air vents. She nodded and didn't argue, and 3 days later she moved into a short-term apartment across town. And we spent the following weeks navigating the kind of careful, exhausted logistics that come after a marriage ends loudly instead of quietly, explaining to Tyler and Bree, in pieces, that mom and dad needed some time apart, fielding Tyler's pointed question about whether the fight was why the mug broke, watching Bree, for several weeks afterward, flinch slightly at any raised voice in the house, a small, devastating consequence of one uncontrolled night neither Paige nor I had ever wanted either of our kids to witness. We filed for divorce that summer. I never learned much more about Cole beyond his first name and the fact that he lived 2 states away. I made a deliberate choice, somewhere in the aftermath, not to go looking for more, understanding that whatever closure I needed wasn't going to come from knowing what he looked like or what he did for a living. Paige told me, months later, in one of the few calm conversations we managed during the divorce proceedings, that she and Cole hadn't continued things either, that whatever it had been hadn't survived being dragged fully into daylight any better than our own marriage had. There was a moment, almost 7 months after the divorce was finalized, in my driveway, dropping off the kids after a weekend, when Paige asked, carefully, whether there was any chance of finding our way back to each other eventually. No, I said, gently but without hesitation. I don't think there is. I think about that fight more than I think about the phone, honestly. I think about Bree standing at the top of the stairs. I don't ever want to be in a room with you again where either of us is capable of getting that loud. And I don't think I can rebuild trust with someone I once screamed at like that in front of our kids, even if some of what I was screaming was true. She nodded, eyes wet, and said, okay. And that was, more or less, the last real conversation between us that wasn't strictly about pickup schedules. The clearest pattern, visible only once I forced myself to look backward with real honesty, wasn't really about Cole at all. It was about the particular emotional texture of a marriage that had, somewhere along the way, optimized entirely for efficiency at the expense of actual intimacy. We coordinated schedules beautifully. We rarely fought. I mistook that absence of friction for evidence of a healthy marriage, when it was actually evidence of 2 people who had quietly stopped reaching for each other emotionally years before either of us consciously noticed the gap. The second pattern, harder for me to sit with, is how completely my own professional habit of methodical, evidence-based diagnosis, useful in literally every other part of my life, became its own kind of blind spot once applied to my marriage. I spent 3 weeks gathering proof with real discipline, and almost none of that discipline, in the moment of actual confrontation, translated into the kind of calm conversation that might have let us actually understand each other instead of detonating into a screaming match that our 7-year-old daughter heard from the top of the stairs. Knowing the facts and knowing how to talk about them turned out to be 2 entirely different skills, and I'd only ever developed one of them. The real turning point in this marriage wasn't the moment Cole first messaged Paige in that forum, or even the trip to Topeka. It was the much earlier, quieter erosion of the kind of daily curiosity 2 people need to keep asking each other real questions, the kind Paige eventually found, devastatingly, in a stranger online instead of in the man she'd been married to for 12 years. That doesn't excuse the 14 months of deception or the phone hidden in our own bedroom wall, but it does explain, with an uncomfortable clarity, exactly the kind of vacuum that allowed it to take root and grow undisturbed for so long. What stays with me most, even now, isn't the phone itself, or even the 14 months it represented. It's the sound of that mug shattering on the kitchen tile and Bree's small voice from the top of the stairs, asking if everything was okay, when both of us, for one terrible night, had become people neither of us actually wanted our children to see. I think about how much damage a single uncontrolled hour can do, completely separate from whatever damage had already accumulated over the preceding 14 months. I don't carry the same rage toward Paige now that I carried kneeling on that bedroom floor with a buzzing phone in my hand. I carry something closer to a tired, clear-eyed sadness. For the marriage, for the version of her that found real connection in a stranger's voice because she'd stopped finding it in mine. And for the version of me that spent 3 methodical weeks gathering proof and somehow never once stopped to ask myself what kind of conversation I actually wanted to have once I had it. If there's a single thing worth sitting with here, it's this. Knowing the truth and knowing how to talk about it honestly are not the same skill. And a marriage that's gone quiet for long enough rarely breaks quietly when it finally breaks at all.